Hello, and welcome to Useful, Beautiful, and Forever, Why the Left Should Lead on Building Beautiful, a panel hosted by PoliticsChange at the 2020 Labour Party online forum Connected. One of the striking features about the debate on building beautifully in this country historically is that it's normally been led by the left. This tradition goes back at least as far as the great Victorian socialist John Ruskin, whom we paraphrase in our title, Useful, Beautiful, and Forever. It continues through William Morris, the arts and crafts movement, the garden cities, and onto the humane social housing projects of the Attlee government after the Second World War. From a very early stage, left-wing thinkers have been concerned about the ways that a free market approach can permit development that creates profit, but that imposes a cost on others, on the community, and on the natural environment. New buildings can enhance the landscape, or it can destroy it. They can contribute to the health and happiness of neighbours, or they can undermine them. Progressive thinkers from Ruskin onwards have stressed the need to interrogate the way that our economy works to create beauty or ugliness, and to empower communities so that they can ensure that new development is a blessing and not a curse. In the last few years, the theme of building beautifully has returned to British politics. The context for this is our national housing shortage, which some have argued, one cause of which some have argued, is that local communities expect new building to be ugly and oppose it for that reason. Maybe then, by building more beautifully, we can help to win the consent of local communities for new development, and in that way we can ultimately help to bring housing to be more affordable once again. This idea seems to interest the government, but in many ways it seems to be natural Labour territory. Should the left be leading on this issue, and if so, how? To discuss these questions, we've got a brilliant panel today. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Rachel Dickinson, reader in English and Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Manchester and Master of the Guild of St. George, which was an educational charity founded by none other than Ruskin himself. Anya Martin, Policy Manager at Priced Out, a campaign to make the government build more homes in order to make housing more affordable. Gail Mayhew, Principal of Smart Growth Associates, co-founder of the Stewardship Initiative, and recently Commissioner on the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. And last but not least, John Cruddas, Labour MP for Dagenham and Rainham. We're going to start with 5 minutes of opening remarks from each of our panellists, after which we'll go to questions from myself and from the audience. There'll be time for some brief closing remarks at the end of our hour. For those joining us on Zoom, if you have any questions, please raise your hand or type your questions into the chat box. The policy is that no question is too outrageous. The list on my piece of paper here, the order is Rachel, then Anya, then Gail, then John. So if that works for everyone, maybe Rachel could start us with some opening remarks now.
Thank you, Oscar. And thank you, everyone, for this great opportunity to share some ideas and bounce some thoughts back and forth. I should start by doing a minor correction. I work for Manchester Metropolitan University rather than the University of Manchester. And in fact, that notion of a former poly and being an institution of the people for the people is an important part of a sort of identity around reaching out and being in community. This notion of community is important, and I'll come back to that in a moment or two. But first I want to pick up on the title of this event, the idea that the left should lead again in building beautifully. And as we've already begun to have set up for us, that's part of the history of the left and of Labour. The early Labour Party, when it was being interviewed in about 1906, was asked, who influenced you? What books influenced you? Ruskin came top of the list. Ruskin actually outstripped the Bible in terms of the number of respondents that said this is what inspired them to become active in envisaging a new, a better, a fairer, and a more beautiful way of living. Keir Hardie, who was instrumental in that movement, much earlier, back in 1893, was talking about how Ruskin was a kind of prophet to him that was helping him envisage a higher, purer, truer life for the people. And my interest as a scholar is really in how do we take these points of inspiration that were being picked up on by people like Hardie back in the late Victorian period and think, how can they be useful to us now? How can they inspire us now? And lockdown has been something of an eye-opener when thinking about beauty and buildings and the notion of homes. I found myself reflecting quite a bit on something Ruskin wrote, and I'm not going to read very much Ruskin to you, although I highly encourage you to go read Ruskin because the beauty of the way he writes. Ruskin talks about the home as being a nest, a place of comfort. And he says that we should plan and resolve to labor for the comfort and beauty of a home, such as, if we could obtain it, we would quit no more. In other words, we would never want to leave it. He describes a cottage all of our own, with its little garden, its pleasant view, its surrounding fields, its neighboring stream, its healthy air, and clean kitchen, parlors, and bedrooms. And I was thinking through lockdown that this does actually describe my home. And it meant that lockdown was a very easy place for me to just never leave again. And that is not the reality that so many people live in. The left has a responsibility to, again, take hold of this conception of the right to beauty, the right to a comfortable home, the right to having a nest that you never want to leave again because you enjoy it so much. And in fact, Ruskin goes on to say, less than this, no man should be content with for his nest. More than this, few should seek. So again, that notion of not trying to live in a palace, not trying to live in a mansion, but live in a place that meets your basic needs for cleanliness, healthy air, and ideally a nice view. When the Labour Party was being set up, it understood this need. There are many who still understand it, but we have perhaps moved away from it a bit over time. And particularly when we think back to sort of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and a lot of sort of social housing and so on that was being constructed, we were not meeting these basic needs. When Ruskin began to set up the Guild of St. George, which is the body of which I became the first female master last year, he declared, for my own part, I will not put up with this state of things passively, not an hour longer. And again, those words have sort of become almost my mantra in the months since I've become master of the Guild of St. George. How do we become more active? How do we stop putting up passively with the current state of things and begin to move on? Now, for Ruskin, a lot of this was thinking about how do we live in a beautiful, peaceful, fruitful kind of way? How do we begin to bridge the urban and the rural and allow the people who live in the two regions to add value to each other's lives and beauty to each other's lives? He talks a lot about art as well, and I'll get a tiny plug in for my own institution at this point. When Ruskin came to Manchester to speak to the Manchester School of Art, which is now Manchester Metropolitan, he talks about fine art, that in which the hand, the head, and the heart of man go together, that coming together of those words that we so often hear talked about in terms of the arts and crafts movement and so on. For Ruskin, it's not just fine art, it's the art of living. It's the art of living in community together and supporting each other and being happy and healthy and hand, head, heart, and good work and good labor coming together. And in fact, this notion that when we build, he writes in the 7 Lamps of Architecture, there's a title for you, he says, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for present delight, nor for present use alone. And so again, that idea of building beautifully now so that it helps future generations. And remembering always that for Ruskin, beauty is really morality. Beauty is being good. And that follows in the next step. And I think that's probably about my time gone. So I will stop talking Ruskin for the moment, but very happy to come back to him later.
Thank you very much indeed. Perhaps some thoughts from Anya now.
Thank you. So I'm here representing Priced Out, which is England's campaign for affordable house prices. We campaign for those who are priced out of buying or renting the home that they need and where they want to live. We look at policy proposals informed by the best economic and quantitative evidence, and we try to put forward practical proposals that we can kind of slot into the existing system we have. I hope you'll indulge me a bit if I focus my opening remarks on why we need to build more homes before we go into how we can then make those homes beautiful. So the first major point that I really cannot emphasise enough is that we have a really severe housing crisis. It's a crisis of affordability. It has predominantly centred in London and the South East on the affordability side, although it is spreading across the country as well. We can see that in the rising cost of housing. The real house prices, that is adjusted for inflation, have increased by around 400% in England since 1970. And that compares to an OECD average of only about 100%, which is still quite a lot. This kind of represents itself in, firstly, the fact that people are simply paying far more money than they used to, but also for those who are unable to increase the amount of money they spend on housing, it forces them into increasingly cramped situations. Again, it varies across the country, but in London, about 1 in every 13 households is overcrowded. That means people aged over 10 who are not couples sharing a bedroom. And then you add on top of this many people who are not overcrowded, but who are living in shared households when they would rather have their own home, suppressed families, people that can't start their own family because they cannot afford a house large enough for them and their child. And this crisis of affordability is in part caused by the insufficient supply of housing, which has been stemming over several decades. Now, there are, of course, loads of factors that feed into prices, rents, or both, not least incomes and interest rates, which influence how much a household can afford to pay. But there is overwhelming economic evidence that we have a supply shortage. So one of the best estimates is conducted by Professor Glenn Bramley, who thinks that we need about 4 million new homes across the United Kingdom. And that covers 330,000 who are experiencing poor homelessness, plus another 3.7 million who are concealed or suppressed, plus older households who are living in homes that do not meet their suitability needs as they age. And there are also many people who are living in poverty after their housing costs. And we do seem to have a particular problem with that here in England and across the UK more broadly. We supply fewer homes than we need because our planning system creates a very strange series of broken incentives for developers and for communities. We've seen that housing stock here has grown 40% below the European average since 1990. We have fewer homes, so you can see there is something quite unusual about what's going on here. And one of the main economic arguments for this is what's called the price elasticity of supply. That is how responsive supply is to a change in price. It's low in England and it's low across the UK. Now, the valid role for planning is to help shape how development happens, to mitigate negative impacts, to ensure adequate infrastructure, and to address market failures in land, because it does have very unusual economic properties. But what we've actually done instead is we've built this labyrinth of a system which is not based on a set of concrete rules about how you can build and what you can build and where you can build it, but a default assumption that you cannot, and then this confusing, highly politicised and a slow process to get permission. It is wasteful, it worsens affordability, and as Transparency International have actually highlighted several times recently, it does encourage and enable corruption. The point I'm getting to, and as you know, this is Priced Out, so we are largely concerned with housing and its relationship with affordability, and the resultant impact of that affordability or unaffordability in pushing people into cramped, unhealthy and unsafe housing conditions. So what does that mean for beauty? Well, I think we're obviously going to talk about this through the course of this event, but I think there's a scope to win here. There's a scope to kill two birds with one stone, because government has put forward a series of quite radical planning proposals. And I think we will go into more discussion when Gail talks about the Building Better stuff that she's been working on as well. But we have an opportunity now, and a massive opportunity, to look at how we can deliver enough homes, but make them very nice homes. Because what we've got at this stage is a system that really gives you the worst of both worlds. You get very few homes, and what comes through are often quite poor and unpleasant, and really don't meet the needs of the people that are supposed to live there and those around them as well. So I'll leave it there.
Delighted to be following these both speakers who've covered so many of the incredibly tricky and difficult points that we try to confront in the Building Beautiful Commission. I think on one hand, Rachel's points where she actually begins to start linking the beauty of the home to the beauty of the environment more generally was one which, tasked as I was with looking at how we could deliver on the objective of securing better and more beautiful development becomes actually one of the most tricky and most difficult. We've got a limited land supply in Britain. We've got very beautiful countryside, which, you know, as a population we cherish very much. We've got incredibly high membership of bodies like the National Trust, the CPRE, and I mean that sets some of the territory around which the conversation about the securing of beauty becomes intricate and complex and sometimes quite contradictory. And so that was essentially what we were trying to resolve. And our late chairman was incredibly keen to move that motivation away from just the protection and conservation mindedness that has tended to sort of create the dialogue around the sort of where beauty sits in the planning system, to enable that to become something that's way more proactive, that actually, you know, helps communities, helps individuals, and helps development companies begin to start thinking through how proactively they can seek to build communities and housing that not only satisfies the utilitarian need for a roof over one's head, but actually delights and gives people that sense of comfort that, again, Rachel's quite right to point out, I think we've all as a population had to get to grips with during lockdown. And I think, you know, gives us some measure of how moving forward we have to build resilience thinking into how we plan. And that brings me to, you know, one of the other big dialogues that was going on. I think that perhaps opens up some of the question around where the narrative and discourse within the Labour Party might you know, take this pursuit of beauty, which is how do we reconcile that incredibly pressing need to accommodate the population better and more comfortably, and hopefully with, you know, with something that approximates to beauty in most people's judgment, with our imperative need to deal with climate change, with biodiversity repair, and this big question that's been posed to us as a, you know, as a society globally on how do we build in resilience if we're dealing with a climate of pandemic going forward. What we got to within the Commission was a view that the form of word stewardship begins to create a narrative that helps us to think those sort of things through, taking a longer term approach, thinking about the long term as well as the short term, thinking about all of the actors in the situation with much more clarity and their needs and desires. And what we sort of focused in on was two things. One was the high level sort of narrative of planning and our sort of sense that that really ought to be extended to think about, I mean, as a Scot, the two other leading lights of the planning world I would bring into the discussion, John Muir, who invented the national parks, and Patrick Geddes, who was the motivating factor in the regeneration of Edinburgh. And of course, before that, the Enlightenment planners who built the Edinburgh New Town as the first healthy city, led by the City Council, who assembled the public and private interests that were active in that day to build something of remarkable beauty. But where we've got to in my area of the Building Beautiful Commission was the view that the big challenge facing us is to change the way that the property market impacts on these issues. Yes, change in planning is needed, but the bigger thing is how do we bring capital and land on a longer term basis to address these questions so that we can deliver development that is genuinely of the quality we all want and need. We backed that up with research. We looked over a historic perspective, on a global perspective, and on the leading schemes in the UK that have delivered on high quality places and beauty, I would like to say as well. And what we found in every case, the land interest was in there over a much longer period than tends to be the case in normal development, and that patient capital had been applied to that. But third point is that local authorities representing the public interest had enabled all the local parties, not just the immediate the local community, but all the different actors, the stakeholders, and people with an interest to have a strong voice. And so those three pillars, land, capital, and the articulation of the local will, to me, are what form a new ethos of stewardship, which we feel is part of the key to unlocking this.
I think it's my turn now. Hi, it's John here. I think there's three reasons I would argue why the left should try and regain this building beautiful agenda. Firstly, as a local MP, actually, I'm a representative of Dagenham and Rainham. We're the site of massive house building over the next few years, and we've been the site of thousands and thousands of new units over the last few years. And I've got major concerns over quality and the regulation of those units. We've had appalling new build developments of hundreds and hundreds of units which have had damp, mold, noise, fireproofing problems. They've had maintenance service issues. We've had repair response times concerns. We've had problems with insulation, with heating systems, district heating systems in particular, and ongoing breaches of regulations and the funding conditions on which they were built. So that's my first concern as a local MP, and we will be having literally tens of thousands of new units over the next 10, 15 years. And my fear is these problems are not going to go away. And second, there's the problem of regulation. We've had problems where we've gone to the HSC, we've gone to the HCA, the Social Homes Regulator, the Mayor's Office, Public Health England, the Ombudsman, and there's a sort of jungle of regulation and oversight which makes it impenetrable, and a lack of accountability for the citizens in terms of their homes that they live in. So that's my first problem. I'm not sure that the extending permission in principle in the government's new proposals will remedy a lot of that. So that creates an opportunity for the left, I would suggest, for them to enter back into this space. The second reason actually is, as the MP for Dagenham, I'm writing a biography of the community, because in November next year, Dagenham is literally 100 years old. 27,000 houses were built over 14 years, housing 120,000 people, are very high quality 2 and 3 bed local authority homes of 94 different types. One resident commented it was like heaven without the gates on. It was that high quality in terms of the provision through some slum clearance out of London, where the LCC built 27 to 29,000 homes to rehouse major parts of London. The point I'm making, it's not beyond our collective wit to do this if we have the political will and the agility in terms of public policymakers. And I was reading just yesterday Terence Young's biography of the community, written in 1934, and one of the first paragraphs, he said, if the Beckentry estate was situated in the United States, articles and newsreels would be circulated containing reference to the speed of which the new town of 120,000 people had been built. The work of the firm contractors would have been shown as an excellent example of American business ideals. If it had happened in Vienna, the Labour and left liberal press would have boasted it as an example of what municipal socialism could accomplish. If it had built in Russia, Soviet propaganda would be making films and emphasizing its rigor and speed and effectiveness. The point I'm making, within our history, we have the capacity to build quality new build appropriate for what citizens should be demanding as almost a constitutional right. And the third element is, as a Labour MP, this agenda will help cement or clarify what Starmerism is, or what Labour is in future. We've had recent experiences of fairly authoritarian leadership and quite instrumental, utilitarian, technocratic oversight. I always remember Ken Morgan used to say you can at best understand the Labour Party in terms of the division between the ILP and the Fabians, created in 1883 and 1884, and that created the central fault line in the history of the left between the Fabian utilitarianism and the more romantic traditions. Unfortunately, to me, it was the latter always lost in the internal debates about what the future debate is. And Rachel spoke very clearly about the historic arc that you can trace back to Ruskin through William Morris, through the early prophets of the old ILP, Keir Hardie, Ramsay MacDonald, and to me, especially George Lansbury. And that's a tradition that we've lost. It occasionally reappears, for example, Aneurin Bevan in the post-war era in terms of council house development, but generally from the 30s, the planners, the scientists, the organisers, the economists, Dalton, Morrison, Jay, Bevan, Gateskill, Wilson, won out a distributional, mechanistic, centralising model of justice came to will out at the expense of this deeper, romantic arc. From time to time, a few have reappeared, but Michael Foot is one example, parts of what Kinnock was trying to do. But increasingly, Labour politics became more instrumental and economistic. So this agenda might well help Labour retrieve a language about what it is to live a good life and provide a different conception of justice to confront these extraordinary challenges that we have, both domestically and globally. So I think the time has come for this sort of more virtue-based tradition of justice compared to either rights-based traditions or models of maximising the welfare of the maximum amount of people. This could create a new space to be populated for the modern left in and around Starmer. But the jury's out on that. But that's why this discussion is so fruitful. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for 4 fascinating starting contributions. I've just been asked to remind anyone joining the Zoom call as we go on that you should raise your hands if you've got any questions, and then my friends here can wire you on. So I wanted to ask first, Rachel, a question about Ruskin's relevance for us now. So one thing that has come up a lot in the past in discussions of Ruskin is this tension between the narrative about craft and the importance of getting production away from sort of factories or more mechanized forms or more sort of huge corporations, as we might think, towards local craftspeople, local industries, and a more democratic kind of production. One of the tensions that has come up over time with that is that sometimes if you have craftsmen doing all the building work, this ends up being very expensive and making the housing unaffordable. So there can be a sort of tension between the importance of that kind of craftsmanship on the one hand and the importance of affordability on the other hand. I was wondering how you see that tension, particularly for us now when we have so much emphasis on the importance of local production chains and of things like this, and how we strike the balance between those two values.
It's a difficult thing, and as we look back through time again, trying to adhere to some of these Ruskinian ideas are easier when there's more free-flowing fun in the system, if we put it that way. I think if we begin to rethink how it might work. So, for example, think about it in terms of issues around co-design and working with the people in the area, having them infuse a sense of what would they like their homes to entail. And so thinking about the craftsmanship spreading out not just from the craftspeople who are building it, but making the people who are going to be living there part of the craftsmanship and part of the designing process. In terms of the cost of bringing in the craftspeople, again, I think we need to be somewhat utilitarian about that in terms of the reality of economics, but there's a possibility to bring in smaller glimmers of the craftsmanship. So have aspects of it which are done very simply, prefabricated, brought in, dare I say, but then finishing touches that are done by craftsmen to help give it that spark of life and individuality. I see Gail's hand coming up. Gail.
Do you know, it's an interesting one, Rachel, because it's another, I mean, as you say, it's one of the deep tensions in this, because we're offered so much by prefabrication and AI these days. And yet, if building sites no longer are the place that people that people are needing to access the labour market cannot any longer go to be employed, it fills me with with dread as to, you know, what happens to the labour market. That, I mean, we're in a absolutely sort of crisis situation clearly at the moment. We're going to have to rethink through all sorts of areas of the economy, and I think we probably will find ourselves facing a stark choice between prefabricated units and well-built houses, possibly built locally, possibly built by local supply chains. And that doesn't just mean craftsmanship, just, you know, in the normal course of building, the building trades at the moment are very highly localized. And it raises some really tricky questions. And, you know, one of the things that we absolutely need to do is to address that head on, and especially politically, and consider whether the most efficient is always the best route. And, you know, is one of the tests that going forward we're going to have to apply is, is this better done on an AI basis, or is it better if done on a human basis because of the non-financial as well as locally financial benefits of it? So I think you touched on an incredibly important point for this discussion.
Anya, one of the things that's come up a lot in the recent public debate on this is this argument that we need beauty as a way of securing consent from local communities, one of a number of ways of securing consent from local communities for development, and so that building beautiful has this key role to play in ultimately increasing the number of houses that we build. But what do you make of that, and what sort of, I mean, if you have any thoughts on how we could sort of move in that direction, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I think there certainly is an argument. You know, if you are consistently building things that are very ugly, very unattractive, don't fit into that kind of fabric of the community, then you are essentially giving people ammo to oppose it, giving them reasons to oppose it. I don't think it is the only reason. So this is very sad, but, you know, I like to amuse myself by looking through planning objections sometimes. And the thing that actually comes out pretty consistently is traffic. It's always traffic. That's an entirely separate problem to this debate. Beauty does come up, but not all of the time. However, I do get the impression, certainly from people working in planning that I've spoken to, that generally if your design is good and it looks good, then you will find it easier to get through, not only because the community is less likely to oppose it, but also because planners tend to prefer it as well. So I definitely think, you know, if we are going to be building things, and you're actually right earlier to mention that we should be building for the future, you know, we should build these things so that they can last some time, it's better for the environment. So we definitely have to do that. How we do it is another question. Obviously, we need to go into the planning system and look at what works about it and what doesn't work. I think the whole kind of way we're set up is it makes it so much easier to build in communities that are quite, or areas that are quite distant from existing communities, because we have this kind of very conflictual planning system. So I think there's a lot of work to address through the planning paper that's come out recently, which is quite light on detail. And so that is one thing that I would definitely urge, you know, people in Labour and people on the left to push that, and push that positively. You know, we do need to build a lot more homes. That's the aim of this paper. So how can we do that in the way that's the most productive in terms of building enough homes, but also that those homes are good, those homes are the types of homes we want. And I was quite interested in the point that John actually made earlier about regulation, because I do think we tend to confuse the planning system with the regulation system, and they really should be separate. It shouldn't be a case of, you know, how sly a developer is, how easily it can, you know, run around the local authority planners, whether a building is safe. You know, that should be a basic requirement of regulation. If you're not going to do it, you can't build it. And then the planning system should be focused on these ideas like beauty and community and co-design, and, you know, where we put buildings and so on that are more co-designable.
I've got a question coming in typed for the whole panel from Jeff Beacon. So, a plot big enough for a house costs £600 at agricultural prices. In York, that becomes about £200,000 with planning permission. I've just got a chalet fields of the Gower showing the beautiful dwellings built on plot lands. These are impossible to build today because of the planning system. And then the outrageous, the planning racket for existing homeowners and landowners. So what about extending the self-build or self-commission initiative and giving planning permission to individuals who are not homeowners? Could that help?
Well, if I can jump in there and say, I think you've really got to the point of the problem there. That is the issue. Our planning system does make it very difficult to build homes. When you look at some of the most beautiful housing that we have in this country, a lot of it is illegal today. You cannot build things like that. It doesn't have enough parking or something like that. So I think the diagnosis is correct. In terms of self-build, I do think that is a potential way that we could look at building more homes. I don't know if necessarily it will be the only way. We do need to be looking at large sites. As I said, we're short of 4 million homes. I don't know if there are 4 million people in this country that could purchase a plot of agricultural land and build themselves a nice cottage, not least because many people want to live near cities and there just simply isn't enough space. But I definitely think that is part of the solution. And actually drawing back to points that were made earlier about kind of local craftsmanship, it really made me think of the way that we really don't have many small builders in this country. A lot of them were wiped out by the financial crisis and they have yet to re-establish. And part of that is because it's such a difficult industry to access. If you cannot spread your risk over sites, then there is a lot of risk because you do have this conflictual, you have this very slow planning system. So it makes it very hard for people to come back in.
Gail.
Being a little bit controversial here, I, having worked in the industry for too many years and have studied it in great length in terms of actually what the weight of influence that planning versus the business model or how those two factors impact most greatly. I have to say, I absolutely would argue that it's the business model, not planning, that's the critical factor, because in fact, the points that the gentleman's making are absolutely correct. How do we access land? How do we get more people to access land, whether self-builders or small builders? If land can be brought into the development equation in a different way, and what we've been advocating through the stewardship initiative is what we hope is a good British compromise between compulsory purchase and market activity. We ask the landowner to put the land in as equity and take a patient position on where they get the returns. We strongly believe that could completely change outcomes. That would then enable that land to be invested in infrastructure. So we bring forward much bigger strategic sites in a manner that actually does allow them to absorb quite serious numbers. But it enables you to focus the capital that's available into infrastructure and amenities first, and then enabling a much wider range of people to participate in development, whether self-builders or small builders or larger builders, but all working within a design code, which is obviously sitting at the heart of the planning reforms that are being proposed. But our very strong position is, in order to make that actually work in a business sense, make it enforceable, it's how you construct that business model in the first place. And so we think that there's something really important there. And I would really urge everyone to stop blaming the planning system. It's only, I'm a lawyer by training. The planning system, what is it? It's the mediation of competing interests. That's actually quite a good thing, to mediate competing interests. But you need a business model that means that when somebody is in that room with those planners, the planners know that that person's actually going to build it out, not trade the land on. And that's where the real problem lies.
Got another question coming in from the audience here for John. In fact, it's a double question. So we have, how do you feel the prospects are for the romantic strand of Labour to steal the march on the utilitarian strand? And or how would those thinkers in either of those traditions, especially the romantic tradition, respond to the government's approach on planning in the white paper?
I'm not overconfident in terms of the internal battles within to capture the soul of the Labour Party, I must admit. I think a cursory look at history would say that we tend not to be on the winning side. And Having said that, you've got to exhaust every possibility. And there is a big issue that what resources has Labour now to draw on? I mean, it's had 4 massive collisions with the electorate. We have, we can't own our own history because Blair stands as an exile within his own party, so we can't own the victories and how we won them. Starmer's 5 years an MP. He's an elusive character because of that. There's not a long trail of books and articles and speeches that define his political character. Now, I think that's all positive because that means there is a space there to contest. And I'd also say, and this touches on some of the issues around craft and value, which you have to confront, because Ruskin was a political economist of culture as well as a great cultural figure, that a pandemic forces us to reset our approach to value in terms of the public domain. So this is a really ripe time to discuss these things. These include issues like the dignity of labour itself in the construction of work, which you touched on, especially amongst those that we often characterise as left behind. They now get clapped and awarded as great public servants because of their vocations, as should the notion of to build things, physical commodities as well. So I think there is a real sort of collision of forces at play here that creates a great opportunity to reimagine a modern romantic left politics that goes with the grain, with something that people want, which is a new normal in terms of coming out of, confronting death forces you to confront what is important again. And that is beyond the traditional notions of exchange value and utility that come to dominate politics. So even though we always lose, I am hopeful but not optimistic, as they usually say. And I forgot the second part of the question because I went on for too long about the first one. But we will see in the next few days in terms of Keir Starmer's speech, we'll see. But the notion of the notion of the home in the left at times, the notion of home and community is seen as almost nostalgic terms, whereas they should be front and centre in our re-evaluation of our left politics. Some view them as simply a statement of believing in community means that you were here first. So there's an inherent racism to it, whereas we have to re-establish an approach to community which is a much deeper, richer, textured thing, which we have owned historically. Now, we'll see where it all goes.
Can I pop in for a second?
Please, I was just going to suggest that.
Because again, I'm thinking that we really are at, despite the trauma of the moment we're living through, it is a moment of real chance to make the world into what we want it to be, and to grab the opportunities to really question, where do people want to live? And maybe that notion of being in a city actually isn't that appealing anymore. Maybe many of us want to be moving a little bit further away from the mass population. And so, it's exciting times. Having said all of that as well, there's that notion of, again, I love that term you've been using, John, around the romantic history, romance with a large R, as in sort of Wordsworth and that tradition. And this notion of making things with our own hands. And so that idea of self-build that we're talking about a little bit here, Ruskin was very much in favor of self-build. He suggested that you go out and make your own bricks. And we do know of people who, again, the last century, on Ruskinian terms, went out and began to build buildings with bricks they made. Ruskin Land in the Wire Forest has a farmhouse that was built by people who left urban Liverpool to move out and try to live a more sustainable community life together. And step one was building their house out of bricks made from the land. And it's still there. So that notion of building to last and building beautifully for the future. They built a pigsty that had a Gothic window in it. Again, what more can you ask for in terms of bringing beauty to the everyday?
Gail, one of the things that came up a lot during the work of the Building Beautiful Commission was the idea that beauty is a sort of distraction from our need to maximize the number of homes, that we shouldn't be focusing on making them look pretty, we should be focusing on just producing the volumes that we need. I think we can all understand the force of that idea, given that affordability is such an issue and the housing shortage is so acute. So I was wondering, what do you think the messages were that the Commission uncovered about that? Are beauty and affordability, are they objectives that are in tension, or can they be complementary? What would you?
Sam, I think that that's sort of answered in a couple of different ways. Oliver Letwin quite recently did a report looking at this ceiling that seems to inflict itself on big schemes around the country, which is really important to the large-scale releases. So we did quite a lot of research, kind of trying to understand some of the dynamics and what they were that were kind of impacting on that. And this is where beauty, if you notion into good placemaking as well as beautiful buildings, begins to actually have quite a potent effect, because if you make great places that people really want to live, it's our view, and this is increasingly backed up by market evidence, that you can begin to start breaking those numerical ceilings on the amount of development a single location can take. So very prosaically, I think there is a real importance to it. At the level of the individual household, I was at pains to try to understand whether by requiring or looking for beauty, we were going to start, making building even more expensive and price people out of the market. And actually within the stewardship-driven schemes that we identified, consistently they delivered on the affordable housing component that had been negotiated. So while I can't say that it's necessarily answering the question of how do we get people into very, very deeply affordable social accommodation, what it's certainly able to do is deliver on an assessed affordability requirement, which is more than can be said for the way that development is currently taking place. This is all to do with expectations on how land value crystallizes and the length of time that value comes back to the landowner on one hand, but also to the local authorities, so party to it. So the very kind of practical kind of answers to your question, Sam, but I think there's another dimension that through, looking at what's happening post-lockdown with this desire to be somewhere that's more healthy, more sanitary, has great views. It's the dialogue at the moment is very binary. Is it the city or is it the countryside? And by city, it tends to be an unwritten that people mean London. I think that dynamic, and this is a really big one for the levelling up agenda and for a future Labour agenda, is should we not be looking at how that dynamic can begin to help create the market forces to regenerate those places that have been considerably left behind? The smaller towns, the smaller cities all over England that just don't have that much, they haven't had that much in the way of investment. This new sort of enthusiasm for living in a more dislocated way, where actually being central is maybe because of digital technology no longer so important, raises massive questions about where we need to be, but also the kind of infrastructure that we actually need as a society to most invest in. I would make a really strong argument that foremost we should invest in places, heavy duty infrastructure second, but I am coming from an urban design perspective.
I have a question for the whole panel here, coming from Richard Barnes. So the lockdown demonstrated how people valued their local green space. So lots of studies show mental health benefits. Will or should the space around new development and access to nature be included in assessment of beauty or quality? I guess we might ask specifically, would that be the case under a new Labour government?
Well, I think it would actually, yeah. And I mean, we have, and if you look at the most innovative, creative civic governance now, they are putting that front and centre. I mean, we're doing Dagenham. We're relocating all of the fish and the meat markets and the vegetable markets out of central London into Dagenham in old reclaimed power station sites, actually, just beneath the Ford stamping plants. And we're using it to try and shoehorn in a debate about total re-landscaping of communities in terms of air quality, green spaces, direct access to parks. And again, I return to the question of creative will. I mean, just reading the history of Dagenham is a really interesting history in terms of in less pretty malign times, there was still that creativity at the heart of civic administration and national governments. I mean, actually, in the report, Stanley Baldwin wrote a report onto the 1934 biography of the community. And Lloyd George was right at the centre of it. So it's not a party political thing. And it was actually then Labour took over as it was emerging as the party of the industrial working class, which is the home of, the Ford Dagenham plant as well. The point I'm making is if you go into the most creative civic administrations now, you do see a renewed attention to these things and making sure that they are front and centre in any brokering negotiations with developers. And this includes, by the way, one other point I'd make, housing associations, which traditionally have filled this gap. Partly our inability to change the business model that Gail was talking about has meant that housing associations are increasingly turning into housing developers and losing that ethical contribution in the market, which has traditionally corrected some of the worst elements of the market itself. So that means that civic oversight and national oversight have to be central to this. But I'm quite optimistic in that front, seeing some of the creativity at the heart of where Labour is best in local government.
We are just coming to the end of our hour, so I wonder if we might go around the panel for final thoughts, just a couple of minutes each. Anya?
Yeah, I think going back to the points that I made at the beginning, we have this serious affordability. That is the problem. That is the absolute priority. I don't think that the idea of making that beautiful is necessarily opposing, but I do think planning is the problem. And we've talked about business models, but ultimately planning is the system of rules in which builders operate. Other countries do not have these affordability systems. Other countries do not have the same design problems we face as well. And that's not because our developers are meaner or naughtier than theirs. So there is a problem that we need to address at the state level. So I think we need to focus on that. As I've mentioned, I do think the planning paper, it does include some things that I would categorically oppose, including reducing the requirements for affordable housing on small sites and so on. But it does actually contain a lot of the seeds, as it were, for some pretty decent reform. But I would urge everyone to try and involve with that in a practical way, in a positive way to make it better. Because there's a lot of work to do. It is at a very high level. So it's a real opportunity. So I hope everyone will join us at Priced Out and other campaign groups trying to influence that for the better.
Gail?
For me, I think there's a huge challenge here for Labour. I think you should look at what we've done, the Building Beautiful Commission, and think how you can step it up even further to deliver a sustainable approach to climate change, to biodiversity repair, take those big issues and meld that with what we've been doing on the Building Beautiful report. And then I think we do something that is world leading in terms of how we respond to the issues of the moment. And I think just the very final thing, some of those issues that Rachel raised and John touched on about actually how do we lead good lives? That's the big question for me. It's that encompasses the requirement for housing that is so important on one hand, but actually these bigger issues, how we work, how we're rewarded for that work, and actually how we impact on the global environment. We can't run away from that.
John?
I just agree with echo everything that Gail and Anya said. Actually, I'd like to say put on record my appreciation of the late Roger Scrutin at this point. Actually, which I should have said in my introductory. I mean, he had a bit of a bad rap from some parts of the Labour Party, but he never did from me. He was a good friend of mine, and I always enjoyed listening to him and learning from him in this space. And I congratulate Policy Exchange for work it's done preceding the COVID, which actually has forced us all to rethink our priorities, and that sense of what is the life we wish to live could create a totally different conversation politically. Now that means we have to sort of drain the swamp a bit in terms of some of the dominance traditions that have crowded out that sort of political thinking for quite a long time on both sides of the political divide. Producing ideas that have been sort of crowded. We've been trying to do on the Labour side for quite a few years. And it's a challenge, but we will continue.
Well, I was a student of Roger Scrutin, and I know he said, he would always say, John Cruddas is really something special and one of my favourite readers. So warm regards went both ways. And Rachel.
As you've each been speaking, one of Russman's most famous phrases has been going through my head. There is no wealth but life. And as we think about what it means to be a wealthy nation, we need to sort of move beyond the purely economic side of things and begin to much more think through what do we need to be truly wealthy. And this notion of beauty and a right to beauty for all and a right to having our own little nest for all, I think is key to then beginning to become a cohesive, happy, healthy and wealthy nation.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all very much indeed for a wonderful and rich conversation. And we look forward to hearing again from you soon.
Thank you.